Well, thanks everyone for coming here in New England as we're in between storms. So this is a webinar. So you can see me, but I can't see you. And on this webinar, we have my wife Lisa as a co-host. So she'll help me kind of keep things straight as far as questions go. So we have a Q&A box that folks can enter questions into. We have a chat box, which typically for these we ask kind of put in where you're from. For these presentations, we oftentimes have people all across the country. So if you wouldn't mind dropping that in there and see how far and wide we're ranging here to talk about Acadia on a chilly Thursday night. There we go. So as far as an agenda goes, we'll do a quick introduction, talk a little bit about United States National Parks. We'll talk about Acadia before it became Acadia. We'll talk about the creation of Acadia. And we'll get into actually taking a look at the park today, the Park Loop Road, which is the main attraction there. Talk a bit about hiking in Acadia, Cadillac Mountain. We'll talk about Rockefeller's Carriage Roads. And then we'll talk about Jordan Pond and some other beautiful vistas in the park. And we'll wrap up with a quick overview of some resources. So with that, we will get started. As far as introduction goes, this is kind of an interesting heat map. This shows in the United States how far you are from a national park. So red means you're 400 miles or more. Blue means you have one pretty close to you. So as you can see here, particularly the middle of the country is kind of void of national parks. Here in the Northeast, we have Acadia up here, and then we don't have anything until we get down here. There is actually an organization, I went to a presentation a few months ago, that is trying to get a national park in every state. That's a huge undertaking, but it's an interesting one. And certainly I think every state has something worthy of a national park. So like I said, Acadia is the only one we have here in the Northeast. There are 63 national parks total. And this is where they are. The green ones are national parks and the yellow ones are major cities. And so you can see we have Acadia up here in the Northeast, and then we don't have anything until we get down to Shenandoah and Cuyahoga Valley here near Cleveland. So there's quite a lot here in the Northeast, obviously with a huge population center that is not very close to a national park. So here in Boston, we're about 4.5 hours, 5 hours from Acadia is the drive up there in ideal conditions. I'm sure it wasn't that this morning, but it is, relatively speaking, it's fairly close, but it is not an insignificant drive to get up to Acadia. And national parks are, you've heard, I'm sure, kind of getting loved to death. This graphic here on the left gives you pretty good visualization of how that has taken off in the last century of the United States. Certainly in the middle of the 20th century, it started going on a pretty steep upward trajectory, and upwards close to 80 million people visit the national park every year. And in Acadia, from 1990 till about 2020, I think it was, 2018 it says, so it was pre-COVID. We were going from about 2.5 million to close to 4 million visitors for Acadia. And we'll see kind of how that plays out in relation to other national parks. So with that as a quick intro, we will talk about Acadia before it was Acadia. We'll take my red thing out of there. So once again, it's up here in the northeastern Maine, or the coastal Maine, down east as it's known. And this is this area here gets kind of blown out, and this is the major part of the park here, out Mount Desert Island. There is a part on Schoodic Peninsula, which we'll talk about, and there is a relatively large portion on Isle of Ho, which we will not talk about since I have not been to Isle of Ho. You can drive to these two parts of the park. This one you have to take a boat from Stonington, and it's supposed to be beautiful. And it is there's a lighthouse out there, and it was a famous bed and breakfast out there. I'm not sure if it still is a bed and breakfast or not, but that is officially part of Acadia National Park. So up here in the Northeast, it's kind of hard to talk about any topography unless you talk about glaciers. And that's no exception here with Acadia. So the last ice sheet that was here and retreated was the Laurentide ice sheet. And that retreats about 12,000 years ago, which is kind of interesting in the fact that, so much stuff happens as the Earth warms and these ice sheets retreat. the Neolithic Revolution, which is basically when mankind starts doing agriculture and starts domesticating animals, and basically creates the bedrock for what civilization becomes. It's not coincidental that that happens as these glaciers start to retreat and you start to have a more temperate climate. But it also has a lot of geological impact on it. And so you see this part where northern part of the United States and pretty much all of Canada was under glaciers. And it's actually kind of fascinating when you get out in Wisconsin, since part of Wisconsin was under a glacier and part of it was not. And it makes for some interesting topography because you can see differences in the landscape where the glacier got this far and then didn't. So it does have a lot to do with what we see in our landscape. And certainly here in New England, we were totally covered by this ice sheet, and many of the geological factors that we see in the landscape today are directly attributable to what happened with this grinding of 10, well, probably think it was 100,000 years or something. That this particular ice sheet, there were multiple ice sheets that happened, and there was, all kinds of volcanic activity, all these things which create a very dynamic nature. Now, some of you may be aware I gave a presentation on Iceland a few months ago, and that's where it's happening in real time today. We have glaciers there, we have volcanoes there erupting, and obviously that's right at the nexus of two plates, tectonic plates, North American and the Eurasian plates that are meeting literally in the middle of Iceland. But a lot of the similar type of activity happened in the area that we know as Mount Desert Island today. It just happened, millions of years ago, and then the glaciers come on top of it and kind of put their own layer of what's going on as far as grinding the landscape. And quite frankly, a lot of it is smoothing the landscape. And you'll see a lot of the mountains and the valleys in Acadia are nice and smooth because they got sculpted by the glacier over thousands and hundreds of thousands of years. And you can see that the glacier was in a north-south trajectory. So this is a topographical map of Mount Desert Island and the geological map, and you see that the striations and the way that these rocks are going is very, very dramatic when you look at it from this perspective. And you see these ridges here, and we see these lakes, Eagle Lake and Jordan Pond and Somme Sound, which is a fjord. I think it's the only fjord on the eastern coast of the United States. And all of this is formed by the glacial activity and creates a very, very dramatic landscape. And the fact that it's this north-south, these ridges are going through here is very directly relation to what was happening with the glaciers. And you can still see some of the residual stuff today. So when you look at some of the rocks, particularly when you're on the ocean looking at the island, and you can see the striation of the different rocks and the formations that happened over the millions of years with the formation of volcanoes, magma, as the rocks settle, and they have igneous rocks, you have sedimentary rocks, you have pretty much all the rocks you can think of, the three types of rocks, and it manifests itself. You can see when these cliffs, we'll see it with the outer cliffs and the other rock formations that are formed at the edge of Mount Desert Island. And you also have what are called erratics, which are boulders that are dropped by the glacier, kind of picked up in one area and dropped in another. So you see those things fairly consistently in the Northeast. We have tons of those things in our neighborhood here in Chelmsford. These are some larger ones. This is Balance Rock, which I don't think technically is in Acadia. It's right off the shore path on Bar Harbor. There is a Balance Rock in Bubble, one of the bubbles, which I haven't got to yet. But this one is pretty dramatic, and it's kind of different. You see different tides, and then also it gives a little perspective here with some kids that are playing here. But this rock is, looks like it's relatively precariously balanced. It's been there for tens, thousands of years. There's actually a bed and breakfast right behind us called the Balance Rock Bed and Breakfast. But it's a pretty dramatic representation of what these erratics are like. You get these large rocks that are basically transported from one area to the next via glacial activity. And the first man, Homo sapiens, that get there are the Native Americans, who basically, once again, as the Earth warms and the glaciers recede, you get this path across the Bering Strait, and so they can migrate from what is basically Russia across the Bering Strait and end up dispersing across North, Central, and South America. And they end up here in Acadia, and this is Nova Scotia here, obviously, and this is New Brunswick in Canada, Quebec. So they're known as the Wabanaki. There's different tribes, the Passamaquoddy, the Penobscot, the Abenaki, but they were residents here for thousands of years, and they were semi-nomadic. So from what they understand, I think from a anthropological perspective, they would spend warmer months near the coast, a lot of fishing, a lot of shellfish. There's a lot of mounds around where the shells from shellfish would be there, oysters, clams, that kind of stuff. And they would fish, of course, and they would migrate inland during the winter. And as the weather warmed up again, they would come back to the coast and once again live more off the seafood. There is a museum dedicated to the Native Americans in downtown Bar Harbor called the Abbey Museum. And it was founded by a physician in the 20s, Dr. Robert Abbey. He had a collection of Native American artifacts, and that was used to seed the museum. It is now an affiliate of the Smithsonian, became that in 2013. It is open year round, and I got the chance to go there 2 years ago, I think it was. It's the first time I've been there, and it is an incredibly well done and fascinating museum. So they have a lot of artifacts there. They have this the room on the right here is the drum room. They do have performances there, I believe. There are a lot of artifacts, clothing. There still are Wabanaki folks in the area. They believe Wabanaki means people of the dawn, which once again, as the title of the presentation alludes to, at least for part of the year, Cadillac Mountain, specifically Mount Desert Island, does get the first rays of sunshine on the continental, well, actually the whole United States. And I would highly recommend checking out that museum if you're in the Bar Harbor area. Then our friend Samuel de Champlain comes along. So he is an intrepid explorer from France. He crosses the Atlantic over 20 times, becomes the governor of New France, and he's involved in founding Quebec City, Montreal. As we'll see in the next slide, he's all over the place in the Northeast. And of course, Lake Champlain is named after him. And as far as explorers go, historically, he gets a pretty good rap. He doesn't have the Columbus baggage around him, and he seemed like he was a pretty competent administrator with these, settling New France, which of course was the settlement of Canada that was French, and then of course they lost it in the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War that ends in 1758 or 1759. And the big part of that is they cede New France to England, Britain. So the colony's there for I guess 100 and almost 200 years, because he's there in the early 1600s, and we'll see in the next slide that it's kind of mind-boggling to think what these guys were doing 300-400 years ago. But he is going and exploring what are pretty harsh, particularly this time of year. If you think about what the weather's like today in Quebec and Montreal, you have lows below zero and high in the single digits, and that's not unusual. But he's out there and he's going through, and this is the St. Lawrence River that ends up eventually into the Great Lakes, and Niagara Falls here, of course, which is going from Erie to Ontario. He does not, I don't think he actually sees that because he cuts around here, but he's in here in southern Ontario and in Quebec. And his second voyage, he goes down here from Nova Scotia and skirts along the New England coast and basically goes from Maine all the way down to Massachusetts and Cape Cod. And he's also a very, very good cartographer. So he's able to really, his maps, I guess, are really fairly spot on, particularly for somebody with this kind of technology 400 years ago. But he is mapping the coastline, and he is also naming things, and he does name Mount Desert Island. We have a thing about that. So this is actually a copy of the map that he drew, and he explores MDI Mount Desert Island in September of 1604, and he writes in his journal, a very high and cleft into 7 or 8 mountains all in a line. The summits of most of them are bare of trees, nothing but rock. I named it L'Île des Monts Desert. So that, I guess, in French means island of barren mountains. What you'll find out in Mount Desert Island, there is this debate, which I haven't really heard a lot of people pronounce it Mount Desert, excuse me, but supposedly there are like about a 50-50 split as to whether people call it Mount Desert Island or Mount Desert Island. And I guess the Mount Desert comes from the fact that in the French, that is what he named it, and that's how it's pronounced, and it means barren. So you have Mount Desert or Mount Desert Island, and he's the one who named it, and it has stuck with that for over 400 years. It's another old-timey map of the island. And you can see once again, it is an island. I mean, there's a bridge that goes across the causeway here from Trenton. So obviously you don't need to take a boat to get there these days. Back a couple hundred years ago, that was not the case. So it is officially an island. And so Idaho is down around here, and Schoodic Peninsula is over here. And like a lot of landscape in America, as we go through the Revolutionary War and we come into the 1800s and we start having some pretty intrepid painters who are going out and representing the landscape. And by doing that, they of course are able to, communicate more what this landscape is about. And probably the most famous of that is the Hudson River School. So the Hudson River School gets attributed as founding to Thomas Cole, who was actually an Englishman, but he ends up migrating to the United States. And he did live in the Hudson River Valley. His house is still there today, right across from his most famous pupil, who we'll meet in a second, Frederick Church. But he unfortunately has a relatively short life. And he passes away, I think like 1847, from some sort of um, probably tuberculosis or something along those lines. That was a huge issue back in those days. But he paints this painting called Frenchman's Bay from Mount Desert Island after a squall. It's currently the Cincinnati Art Museum. So a very dramatic seascape. And this starts, kind of informing folks about what, amazing landscapes we have in the United States. And so this Hudson River School, these Hudson River artists go all over the place, including all over the world. I mean, Frederick Church is down in the Andes. He's at Niagara Falls, Bierstadt's out in the West Coast. So these guys are all over the place, and they're portraying this very, very dramatic landscape, which gets people really interested in seeing this stuff. And the other artist in the same time frame, which is pretty famous here in New England, is Fitzhenry Lane. He was based out of Gloucester. He's actually officially labeled, I guess, as a luminist. Owes a lot to our friend J.M.W. Turner, but he himself is up in Mount Desert Island. And this is a painting he painted in 1856 before the Civil War called Off Mount Desert Island. And a lot of his escapes are like this. They have a sailing ship somewhere in it, and they had this kind of, pink, beautiful sunrise, sunset type of sky. Once again, makes it like a place that might be interested to visit. Frederick Church himself has a number of paintings in the area. One of his more famous ones is Twilight, Mount Desert Island, Maine, 1865. This one is kind of interesting in the fact that it is very dramatic, obviously owes a lot to Turner. So if you're familiar with Turner's landscapes, Turner's skies in particular, Turner was very noted for his skies. He passes away in the 1850s in Britain and England, but his stuff is certainly communicated, and other painters are aware of what he's doing. So this is a very Turner-esque view of it. It is very ominous. Once again, if you look at kind of the time frame, 1865, this is a Civil War. So, a lot of these landscapes kind of have more to it than you might think. And, some of the Hudson River Schools is about, painting things very bucolic and, almost unnatural in the fact and how kind of perfect they are. But they do have some depth to it. And Church does some amazing stuff, as he is probably one of his most famous paintings is of Niagara Falls. That's the National Gallery, I believe, down in DC. But this once again kind of creates a lot of interest up in this neck of the woods as to, wow, this is someplace that folks might want to go visit. And it continues even to the Impressionistic era. We have Charles Haslam, who is probably the most famous American Impressionist. And he did a lot of painting on the New England coast. If you saw a presentation I did a few times ago, he was out in the Isles of Shoals off the coast of New Hampshire and Maine, and he did a lot of his work off of Appledore Island there. I think 10% of his output was based on Appledore Island, and Celia Thaxter, the poet and writer who had a whole salon out there. But he also did venture up north to Mount Desert Island, and he has this ironbound Mount Desert Island in 1896. So what that does is, it's got a kind of a double-edged sword in the fact that it, creates popularity, creates, interest in this, but it does increase obviously tourism. And now you have some technological changes. You have steam trains coming into play. You have steam ships, so people can get to these places relatively easy. You can make the argument that certainly from a public transportation perspective, it's easier to get to Mount Desert Island in like 1890 than it is in 2025. Also up in this neck of the woods, this is Maine. There are a lot of trees. You have logging. So there's a lot of pressure on the landscape from logging and the interest in the logging industry to turn that into to monetize it and get all the lumber out of that from both a heating and construction perspective. And then also you have watershed pollution. I mean, even to this day, a couple of the lakes there, Eagle Lake and Jordan Pond, are water sources for the area there for their drinking water. And so there's a lot of pressure as the increased interest and population and kind of unregulated development starts happening. Even in the 1800s, you start having some threats to the watershed and to the water supply. So, all that being said, that leads to this is something we might want to preserve. So, the creation of Acadia National Park, we have kind of some main players here. George Dorr, who was kind of considered the father of Acadia. We have Charles W. Eliot, who was a president of Harvard, and he was very instrumental in creating Acadia National Park, as was his son, who's Charles Eliot. Unfortunately, he probably actually had more to do with Acadia in the early part of the formation of the park and getting the land and stuff along those lines. Unfortunately, he dies of spinal meningitis, I believe, in the late 1800s. So his father kind of takes up that baton. If you're familiar with the Trustees of Reservations here in Massachusetts, which is a organization that owns a lot of property in Massachusetts, the Crane Estate, Crane Beach probably being the signature properties, that was started by Charles Eliot, Charles W. Eliot's son. So that kind of metaphor of the trustees of this umbrella organization really owning these properties, that becomes what they're looking to do in the area of Acadia. So the trustees are actually established, I think they're established in 1890s. So that's well before the official establishment of Acadia National Park. So that kind of concept is there. Then when we get into the early teens and 20s, we have John D. Rockefeller Jr., who will meet him later, a little bit more detail with regard to the carriage roads. And then, of course, these national parks. The thing about a national park, in order to get established as a national park, now there's a lot of different, national historical park, all kinds of different national monuments. There's all kinds of different designations, and those do actually have some differences that by how they're run and how they're established. A national park has to be established by an act of Congress. The national monument is not. And you'll see that various presidents, I know Obama, I think Biden as well, did establish national monuments, and they can do that as a presidential order. But a national park has to be an act of Congress. So we only have 63 of them. We have a whole mess more. And even places like right around here, Concord, the Old North Bridge, that's a National Historic Park, which is different than a national park. So it's run by the National Park Service, but doesn't have the same designation as a national park. So that's kind of a pretty big deal. So you need to have a lot of political clout to do that. The Secretary of the Interior at the time, I believe, was under the Woodrow Wilson administration. It was a guy named Franklin K. Lane. And so he was amenable to it. And so he helped shepherd a lot of this through. And George Dorr is the kind of the guy who is really organizing all this stuff. And like I said, he is the father of Acadia. He was born 1853 in Boston, I believe, and dies up in Bar Harbor in 1944. He was an heir to a textile fortune, but he does basically spend all of his money, and he ends up being a superintendent for 40 plus years. Ends up dying pretty much penniless, but he undertakes much of the effort to work with both state and federal officials to designate the land that becomes Acadia. And once that does happen, he becomes a superintendent, like I said, till the end of his life. So it's probably about 30 years or so that he's a superintendent. Um, so the weird part about it is, and this is what makes it a little bit interesting when you start reading some of the history of Acadia, the mountain names are different. So the famous one, and we'll get to it, is Cadillac Mountain. That was actually Green Mountain. And we'll see that it was called Green Mountain for quite a while. One thing that Dorr does as the father of Acadia and being the superintendent, he unilaterally, I guess without a lot of consultation, just renames all these mountains. So there is one named Dorr Mountain today, which I don't think he named that himself. That got named later. But it is kind of interesting. And from a um, consistency perspective, it gets a little bit confusing, but he thought the name should be different. There's a Champlain Mountain, so he wanted to name something Champlain Cadillac Mountain, which I guess the explorer Cadillac was, I guess, closer to Columbus than he was to Champlain. So he's got kind of a checkered past, but George Dorr liked him, and so one of the mountains in Acadia is named Cadillac. And I do see a question here about what's the source of the name Acadia. And there's different versions, but it seems it's based on a Wabanaki, or I don't know if they're actual Algonquin or Abenaki language, that they had a word similar to that, which I think means place. And so you do see that Champlain, when he comes in, what he calls Acadia is basically from Nova Scotia, I think all the way down to Cape Cod. But we'll get into the story of like why it actually, because it wasn't originally called Acadia National Park. That was not the original name. And there's a bit of a story about why they changed that. So we'll see that in a few minutes. This thing Lisa and I just found last year, actually, Doors Family Estate. So he comes from this rich textile family in Boston, and they, of course, have an estate. So one thing about Bar Harbor in the late 1800s, this is the height of the robber barons, all these ultra wealthy people. And so you have Bar Harbor being a place that they go to in the summer, very much like Newport. So these places start having, really large mansions. And the Door family does have a mansion, and it is called Old Farm. And it has since, I don't know if it actually burned down. I think it was actually taken down in the 50s. We'll get to the whole fire of 1947, but it is no longer there. The remnants are there, and it is actually not that far from Bar Harbor. So you drive down Main Street out of Bar Harbor, going south out of it. On the left, there is a park. It actually goes down to the water. There's some trails, and there are remnants of the estate. And photographers are always kind of looking for decay and things along those lines. So the stairways and some of the foundations of this old building in the woods of around Bar Harbor is kind of fascinating. And as I said, it's a beautiful place. The trails are pretty open, and there are some, you can get down fairly close to the water. And it was a beautiful location, obviously, with this huge mansion. You're going to have some sort of access to the water. But I have to admit, I really wasn't familiar with this until this year. And I don't think I mentioned at the beginning, but I've been to Acadia probably about a dozen times. And the thing that we try to do every time is we have some favorite things that we like doing, but we also try to at least to do one or two new things. And there's plenty of stuff to do in Acadia National Park. So one of the new things we checked out last year was the remnants of Old Farm from the Door family. So this is a timeline of the creation of National Park and the naming. So it gets the initial national monument, which once again, this can be declared by a president. So Wilson is the president in 1916. George Dorr and his cohorts are able to convince him to designate a national monument, and they have a small area called Sur de Mont. And that's basically the establishment of when what becomes Acadia first happens. Then the official designation, once again, this happens after World War I. So you see the national monument only requires the president in 1916. Once World War I is over in 1918, there seems to be more of an appetite for legislation like this. So it gets designated as Lafayette Park. Then in 1929, it gets renamed to Acadia. And the story behind that is there was once again this Uber tycoon. His name was Moore, and he owned a lot of the land of what is Schoodic Peninsula, Schoodic Point, which is further north than Mount Desert Island. He passes away. His wife inherits the estate, which isn't necessarily always the way it happens. But she, I guess, this is like too much, and this would be good to give this to the people and all that stuff. And so she wants to donate the land to Acadia National or to Lafayette National Park. The weird part about it is she has some kind of Francophobe thing where she doesn't really like the French. Lafayette is named after Marquis de Lafayette, the famous Revolutionary War hero. So to appease her, George Dorr changes the name to Acadia. What is odd about that is, even though Acadia is an Indian name, it was really coined by Champlain, who of course is French. So, and the other thing that's kind of weird is you'll see the dates sometimes. You see, like, they'll have Acadia National Park and all the date associated with it as far as when the establishment was. You'll see 1916, you'll see 1919, and even sometimes you'll see 1929. So this timeline kind of explains where that, the official name of Acadia National Park does not come into being until 1929, but the entity we know as Acadia National Park really comes officially in 1919, and the National Monument, which is kind of the precursor, comes in 1916. Okay, somebody actually said about Old Farm that it fell into disrepair and the Park Service decided to tear it down. That does sound familiar. So Acadia by the numbers. It is 50,000 acres, which actually is relatively small as far as national parks go. It's 49th out of the 63 as far as the size of national parks. It has 60 miles of coastline, 33 miles of scenic roads, 50 miles of carriage roads. We'll get into those in a little more detail, and 150 miles of hiking trails, and we'll talk about that. And it does have over 3 million visitors each year, which is interesting because it's the seventh most visited national park. but it's 49th in size. So what you have is, surprise, surprise, the equation of, I mean, 50,000 acres is big, and I'll talk a little bit more about some things you can do to kind of avoid the crowds. And I'll admit, I have not been there in the height of the summer. I have actually avoided that very specifically, but it is an extremely busy place, and it is relatively small as far as national parks go. So when you see the numbers with that, it is kind of shocking that it's one of the smaller national parks, but it is one of the most visited. And once again, it is fairly close as far as population centers go to the East Coast, and with Philly, New York, DC, and Boston. And once again, just kind of a level set here. This is the main part of the park on Mount Desert Island. This is Schoodic up here by Winter Harbor. And this is Ellsworth, which is probably the quote unquote biggest city as you're close. You kind of go through Ellsworth as you go into Mount Desert Island. And Bar Harbor is the kind of main drag on Mount Desert Island. As far as I know, the only major chain grocery store, Hannaford's, is in Bar Harbor. We stayed in Southwest Harbor actually a couple of times. That's the quiet side of the island, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but that's definitely a place worth checking out. And there's Schoodic Peninsula. As I mentioned, you have to kind of actually go back this way. To get to Schoodic Peninsula, you have to kind of drive off the island, go back up here, go back down Route 1, and then go to Schoodic. So it's about an hour. It's which is it's not horrible, but it definitely is some time, and it's much more undeveloped. There are some pullouts. There's one road that goes all the way around. There are some facilities here. This is the main attraction, which is Schoodic Point, which juts out into the Atlantic, and it's one of those places. If you've been up to Cape Ann, right by Gloucester and Rockport, there's a place called Halibut Point, which is kind of similar. It sticks out in the ocean, and it's one of these things where if you want surf, pretty much anytime you go to Halibut Point, pretty much anytime you go to Schoodic Point, you're going to see some surf. So that's kind of a cool place. It did inspire some artists. The mid-century modernist Marsden Hartley, who was actually from Maine. He was a cohort of Georgia O'Keeffe. There was a show actually at the Clark Institute out in Williamstown a few years ago of Georgia O'Keeffe and Marsden Hartley. He painted in 1942, Evening Storm, Schoodic Point. It's at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. My interpretation of it, I said it's pretty easy to get some good wave shots. And this is Winter Harbor Lighthouse, which is kind of across the harbor as you're looking at the left side of Schoodic Point. I believe that's actually Cadillac Mountain there in the clouds, but it is a beautiful place. It is an absolutely beautiful place. And, certainly, like anything, any travel you do, it's all based on time in which you have, logistically can do, but certainly Schoodic Point is definitely worth visiting if you're going to do a deeper dive. And Sur de Mont, as I mentioned, this was the original place for George Dorr for establishing a park. He kind of created this little spring here. Sur de Mont was actually Champlain's commander on his first trip. It's a title, French title. I actually don't know what it means. I probably should know that means Sir to something. But he was the guy who was in charge of the whole shooting match going over the first time Champlain went. So George Dorr basically gave homage to him and named what is basically the seminal part of Acadia in Sur de Mont. And it's a beautiful area. We'll get into it a little bit. Okay, so there's the Jessup Trail, which is there. It's a boardwalk trail through the birches, and there's actually a stone path there, which we'll get to in a second, called Homan's Path, and it's a beautiful, beautiful area. And there's actually a Acadia wild gardens there, which once again, most of the time that I've been to Acadia has been fall, and it's beginning later and later fall each year as actually fall kinds of extends, and the weather actually has maintained itself being a little bit better. And the crowds have kind of tamped down. So unfortunately, the one downside of that is that the wild gardens are pretty much gone because we're usually after the first frost, and all that is gone. But it's a beautiful area there, and it's once again fairly quiet. Oh, somebody said they did not lose anything, so that's good. So the fire of 1947. So obviously we're certainly familiar with wildfires that recently happened out in Pacific Palisades and the LA area. Certainly, this is not on that scale necessarily, but it was a pretty big deal. So this happens in 1947. These are some of the old pictures. You can see this is actually looking, I think, from the across Schoodic Peninsula. As you see the smoke. Sur of the mountain, somebody says. Okay, thank you. That makes sense. Sur de Mont. And you see here, once again, some of unfortunately the pictures you've seen from the LA area, all that's left are the chimneys and the brick. And so it was pretty devastating fire. A lot of the mansions, like I said, this was a big, summer haunt for wealthy folks from up and down the East Coast. And a lot of those mansions, like probably most of those mansions, were lost during that fire. So a lot of that was taken out. And let's see, it was a pretty big deal that went on for, a good week, week and a half. And this is basically a color representation of how the fire traversed. But you see, the eastern edge of the island here. This is down where this is where the Park Loop Road is and all that kind of stuff. I think Cadillac Mountains up here. But as far as Bar Harbor goes, Bar Harbor proper survived it. But a lot of the area, because this is all coastal area here, and this is where a lot of the mansions were, and a lot of forest was burned. So you do have a change in the ecosystem. And, these ecosystems are much more dynamic than we probably realize. And, you have the whole story with New England, where it was much less forested in the 1800s than it is now because of all the farming and all the wood being chopped down for fuel and for building. But this also, and through hurricanes too, the hurricane, I think it was might have been Hurricane Diane in the 50s that went up the Connecticut River Valley. That had a huge impact on what we know as foliage in New England. It took out a lot of the pine trees because the pine trees have shallow root systems, so they tend to go first in a lot of these windstorms. But also with fire, when the fire burns the forest, it comes back, and the hardwoods are the ones that are coming back. And so the hardwoods are the ones that give us the foliage, obviously, the maples, the oaks, that kind of stuff. So it does change the ecosystem of Acadia in a really significant way. So with that said, the Park Loop Road is kind of the famous part of it. Goes up here from Bar Harbor, get to it a couple of different ways. You go down along the coast here, end up down, we'll visit some of these places, Sand Beach, Thunder Hole, take a look at the Otter Cliffs, go this way, end up at Jordan Pond with the famous Jordan Pond House, and continue back along Eagle Lake, and you can get back up toward Bar Harbor. So it's about, I think it's 17 miles. But typically, if you're doing like the quick and dirty of Mount Desert Island and Acadia National Park, you're doing the Park Loop Road. And I do believe they plow part of it in the winter. I don't think they can keep the whole thing open, but you can get off of it down here, get down here to Seal Harbor and Northeast Harbor over here, which is Martha Stewart's place is around here somewhere. So this is where a lot of the really, really wealthy folks are down here. And Seal Harbor was where John Rockefeller's place was as well. So Sand Beach is really the only beach of any significance on the island. And last winter, I believe, a lot of the sand got washed away in a nor'easter, but we had a couple of nor'easters in January of 2024. But I guess it kind of, this was taken from this October, so it kind of got back to its relatively normal state. This is a photo taken up from a hike on a place called Great Head, looking down at Sand Beach. And I believe this is the Beehive. In the background, you can see the Sand Beach kind of has behind it this water. So it's an interesting place, very crowded, and like I said, it really is, as far as beaches go in the area, is really the only beach of any significance. And it is northern Maine, North Atlantic, Gulf of Maine, and it's cold, so the water is very cold. And this is a view of Sand Beach from the ocean. They do have cruises out of Bar Harbor you can take. The actual National Park Services conjunction has some wildlife cruises you can take, and they have some lobstering cruises, and those are well worth the time. Thunder Hole is this kind of natural phenomena where I think it's like 2 hours before high tide. When the tide's coming in, there's a geologic formation underneath where the water comes in and then gets kicked up and creates a boom. So it creates this thunder sound, hence the name Thunder Hole. I have to admit, I don't think I've really been there at that time, but a couple of years ago, I was there at this fascinating time where the water was going over the walkway out there, and there were people on the walkway, which I find absolutely crazy. So I did a long exposure. As you can see, the water kind of washing over. And fortunately, we didn't see anybody that went with the water to get washed over, but it was kind of crazy. And there were people down at this end who were running away from the water as it came. And of course, as you can imagine, as this water comes over these rocks, it's pretty slick. But this wasn't exceptionally, I mean, there was no exceptional storm. We were there. It's just, it's the rough and tumble rocky Maine coast, and Thunder Hole is a pretty extreme example of it. But then on the flip side, right to the right of it, is this very peaceful outcropping with this gentleman looking out at the ocean, and it's very, very peaceful. Otter Cliffs This some photos taken from the water, and people do climb these, so they're kind of a hot spot for actual rock climbing, technical rock climbing. And you can see once again from a uh, geological perspective, you can see these striations in the rock, and all these different things that are worn away by the ocean and previously worn away by the glaciers. I love this picture of. I'm not a huge fan of heights, but these folks are kind of assessing the whole situation. You can see all the hiking gear they have, and they're about to rappel down the outer cliffs to the base. Uh, so we'll transition now. I see there are some comments. A few years ago, we took a boat ride from the College of the Atlantic to Winter Island, and the researchers were doing research during the boat ride. Fascinating. It is fascinating about some of the stuff that's on the island. There is the College of the Atlantic, which is a four-year college. And of course, I think they have a lot of oceanography degrees and things along those lines. There's also a Jackson Laboratories, which is a medical research thing on Mount Desert Island. So there's some significant academic heavyweight that goes on there, and there is a lot of research that goes on out into the waters. And there's a lot of birds. I think they have puffins up there in the summer. So definitely one of the naturalist cruises is amazing. And there are a lot of islands around Mount Desert Island itself, which are Swans Island, the Cranberry Islands, a lot of different things there that are fascinating. And there are a lot of ferries that go out to those islands, so they do have access to them. So there's definitely a lot more there than just the actual park. And some kudos for Thunder Hole and how amazing it was last May. So we'll quickly go into hiking. This is the Bates Cairn, which is a hiking device used in Acadia to give you direction on a trail. So it's basically built with stones as a base there, so water can go through. This is the rock that points the direction of the trail. So I do believe they do blazes as well, but this is a kind of a neat thing that they have as you're hiking through some of the areas in Acadia. And like I said, there's over 150 miles of hiking trails in Acadia, so there's plenty of hiking and plenty of breadth of type of hiking, which we will get into. This is just some visual representation that I actually have done some hiking there. Like I said, I don't have a love of heights to a certain degree, so some of these things we're going to talk about, the beehive, the precipice, those things aren't really up my alley, but there's a lot of different stuff, and you get great vistas. This was Connor's Noble, which is a really neat hike, not terribly difficult, but not, there's some, a lot of rock. I don't think there's any actual scramble, but, it's more than a walk in the park, and it gives you some great vistas. The only downside to Connor's Noble is to get to the base trail, you have to walk about a mile on the carriage roads. So it does take a bit of time to get there, but we'll talk a little bit about how you can kind of expedite your trip on the carriage roads. This is Homan's Path that I mentioned before. This was kind of had fallen into disrepair. I think they resurrected it in the 1990s, and this is accessed off of Jessup Trail, which is by Sur de Mont. So it's pretty quiet. It's an area that there isn't a lot of activity, and it's a little known. And this is one of these new things that we did last year. I had read about these stairs, and it sounded kind of interesting. It was right off of Jessup's Trail, and you get some pretty nice vistas as you look off of there. And this is looking out over, actually, Jackson Laboratories is kind of down here. But this is looking over, I believe that is Scoodic Peninsula as you're looking across Winter Harbor there. But, fall is amazing there. It does last a while. It's a bit later because it's closer to the ocean, so it's a little more temperate than interior northern Maine. And we've been finding the last few years we've been going there, there's plenty of foliage left after Columbus Day. And we were very fortunate last year. We had that drought, if you remember. For those folks in New England last year, we had that drought during the fall, which wasn't great for the water table and some other things, but the weather was unbelievable. And this is probably the best weather we've had that we went to Acadia. So that was just amazing. And this is the beehive. This is our daughter, Laura Kate. Her boyfriend took these pictures. This was not photographed by me. You can see the beehive is right on the edge here. They have a couple of iron railings here. The precipice, which I don't have a picture of, has some straight up iron ladders you have to go, and that's supposedly kind of the ultimate hike in Acadia. But there's no shortage of folks here, and you will hear stories about people doing these hikes in flip-flops and all kinds of stuff. The challenge with Acadia we found there is, particularly in the fall, is rain and wetness. It's, these things are all granite, so any kind of rain makes them incredibly slippery. So that has actually thwarted us a few times, some hikes, in the fact that it was just too wet to go. But it is an amazing place, and all these things do have amazing views. And I will say, on a little bit different tact, is some more calm things. And so this is, as we talk about the quiet side of the island. So this is the Park Loop Road. This is all this over here. Or excuse me, Bar Harbor's up here, but you have to go up around Somme Sound, and you come onto this area, and the big, quote unquote, big town there is Southwest Harbor. And there are still parts of Acadia National Park here, plenty of hiking. There's mountains there, great stuff, but it's so much quieter than this side. And you'll get here with the trailheads will be filled up at 8 in the morning, and you'll go to a place. We want to hike the Bubbles, which we'll get to in a little bit, out of Jordan Pond, north of Jordan Pond. And it's really hard because the trailhead just fills up so early, even after Columbus Day. Very, very busy. So the bulk of the population and people are going up here. So if you're going to hikes off of here, there are some mountains that are hiked. I think it's Gorham Mountain is off of one of the stops on the Park Loop Road. It's a very, very nice hike, but unfortunately the parking lots there get really full. And in the summer they do have the Island Explorer, which is a bus that goes around, which helps to um, mitigate some of the traffic, but you are tied to a bus schedule and that kind of stuff. But here on the quiet side, this is a very, very mellow, it's called Ships Harbor and Wonderland Trails. And they're kind of a wooded hike that goes to the ocean, and they're just very serene. You kind of get some great forest bathing, and then you get these incredibly bucolic, relatively calm views of the estuary and the ocean. And we rented a house for 2 summers, geez, 20, 25 years ago. We did it twice, few years apart, in Southwest Harbor. So we were just literally down the road from this. So became much more familiar with some of the stuff that's available on that side of the island. And it's just amazing. And like I said, there's really not a lot of folks there, and incredibly bucolic. And you really do. I said, all the pines are there. You get the great forest experience. And then you open up to some vistas on the ocean. So highly recommend that if you don't want to tackle some of the more challenging things in Acadia. But like I said, it's really got both of them. So you can kind of meet whatever you want to do. Let's see here. Somebody says, is Enemy Moan Cave still accessible? I'm not familiar with that. And there's also somebody's recommending the Acadia You Haven't Seen, 2 volumes, which unsigned hikes to some historic sites and caves at Water's Edge. I mean, there's just a plethora of stuff there. It is amazing. But with that said, we will jump to Cadillac Mountain. It's 1,500 feet, the highest point on the eastern seaboard. And at sometimes during the year, in the winter, it is the earliest sunrise in the continental U.S. And I have been to Cadillac Mountain for sunrise. Cadillac Mountain does now require you to get timed tickets. Like they're like $6. Most of them only open up about 2 days in advance, which actually makes total sense because, as we'll see, the weather on Cadillac Mountain is incredibly variable. And actually, I've experienced some of the strongest winds in my life on top of Cadillac Mountain. But I did go there. This must be 20 plus years ago. I did do sunrise at Cadillac. It's kind of back in those days, there were no, ticketing. So it's just, and there was a lot of people up there. And, it's one of those experiences where I'm always kind of of 2 minds about these things when there's a bazillion people around you and, at sunrise, and, how great an experience is it? It is amazing to see the sun crack the horizon. And of course, it's over the ocean and the islands and everything else. It's beautiful. But you are there with your closest couple hundred friends. So I did it once. Like I said, it's really dependent on the weather. So you really have to, kind of, if you want to go, you probably want to just kind of, not make the decision until a day or two beforehand and hope there are some tickets available for you to get up there. But I will say that the sunsets at Cadillac Mountain are almost as good. And those are a little bit easier to get to. And pretty much every time we go to Acadia, we do go up there around 4 o'clock or so and spend an hour and a half taking a look at what's going on there. And Mother Nature usually treats you to a pretty decent sunset from there. And this is looking west, obviously, it's sunset. So we're looking west across, I believe that is Somme Sound from the top of Cadillac. As I mentioned before, Cadillac was called Green Mountain before George Dorr got his hands on it, but it also had a cog railway. If you're familiar with the cog railway up Mount Washington, there are actually a lot of those around New England, but this one only ran for about 7 years, but it did go up the side of Cadillac Mountain. So there was actually a cog railway. And I guess somewhere there are some residual tracks you can see. I haven't seen them, but somewhere around there, there's still a little bit left of that cog railway. But you can drive up Cadillac Mountain. I'll admit I have never hiked up it. You can do that as well, but you can drive up. Relatively easy trip up there, and there are some good lookouts on the way up and the way down. And you get to the top now with the ticketing. You don't have to worry about circling for a parking spot like you used to have to do that before COVID. So now the good side, I guess, of having ticketing is you're pretty much guaranteed a spot up there, and it's well worth it. And you get some pretty amazing vistas looking out over 360 degrees of Acadia and the Atlantic Ocean. Sometimes this is before they were charging for the tickets. You also to get time tickets, but we got a couple of time tickets at a trip a few years back, and we were trying to kind of spread out our risk, and we got a couple of different days. One day ended up being great, one day ended up being not so great, but since we had the tickets anyway, and I was kind of curious of what Cadillac Mountain looks like in the fog, and once again, you're on the coast of Maine, so fog is something you're going to encounter more often than not, different times of the year, and you don't see much. Somebody meditating up there, and it's kind of ethereal with the trees and the mist and everything else, but obviously seeing any kind of vistas or things along those lines, you're not going to see much up there in the fog. So carriage roads. These are the famous bridges on the carriage, the stone bridges, and this is myself with e-bikes. So we'll talk a little bit about the carriage roads. They were started and funded by John D. Rockefeller, the son of John D. Rockefeller, who was the oil titan. So John D. Rockefeller Jr. is also the man behind Rockefeller Center down in Midtown Manhattan, which we were there a couple of weeks ago. So I thought, oh, that's interesting. It's a little picture of him, of his obelisk there, that he basically funded Rockefeller Center, and he also funded the carriage roads. And they were built from 1919 to 1931. There's about 50 miles of them, and they do have 17 stone bridges. So they basically are on kind of the central eastern part of Mount Desert Island, and you can get to them. There is a bike shop, a couple of different bike shops. We've rented from Bar Harbor Bicycle Shop, and we've gotten e-bikes. That hike I was talking about to Connor's Noble, when we were walking, we saw a couple who had e-bikes, and they were from North Carolina. So we stopped to chat with them about, what the whole deal was with e-bikes, because I had not ridden one before. I do have a quote unquote regular bike I ride fairly regularly in the summer. Road bike, weighs about 20 pounds. And they were singing the praises of e-bikes, so much so that we met them in line at the at the bicycle shop the next morning. They were back for another round. So my only experience with e-bikes is on carriage roads in Acadia. We've done it 3 years. They are pretty pricey. It's like $70 per bike for half a day, but they're amazing. I mean, and you have to pedal. They're not the throttle kind of e-bike. You have to pedal in order for them to go, but you get different levels of boosting. And the carriage roads are fairly hilly. The downside to them is they're heavy bikes. So if you don't have the electric part of it, I wouldn't want to ride one of those bikes up a hill without electric assist, because they're probably about 60 pounds or more. Like I said, my bike's about 20 or so, like 3 times the weight of my regular bike. Although my regular bike is not I wouldn't do well on a gravel road. But these are, they were developed for horses, and they were not developed really for cars. Rockefeller wanted to kind of keep cars out from the interior, and so he had the money to do that, and they built them during the Roaring Twenties, and they're an incredible access. I mean, it says it's 50 miles of them, so if you walk them, you can't really go that far because it takes a long time to walk anywhere. But the e-bike makes it so we usually do about 20 to 25 miles in our 4-hour renting, and we basically go from here all the way down around Jordan Pond and go back. And Jordan Pond is right around here, and so you can go on either side of it, and it's amazing. Highly recommend it. And like I said, those are of the 17 bridges. They're obviously impeccably made out of stone. These here they're called Rockefeller's teeth, and they're these granite boulders that kind of line the carriage roads in various points. Horses have the right of way. So they are the number one in the pecking order as far as any kind of transportation going on these carriage roads. And you do run into horses every once in a while. You can actually take a carriage ride up Day Mountain, I believe it's called. You can take it's like an hour and a half, 2-hour carriage ride. You can take that up and take an actual carriage ride driven by horses up to Day Mountain. And this is a little bucolic view of what it's like riding a carriage road in the beautiful October sun. And it's, with the leaves on the carriage road and, going through the underneath the bridges and everything, it really is an amazing experience. So I would highly recommend that. And we will wrap up now with Jordan Pond and other vistas. I see folks. Nobody's talking about, let's see, before I change here, the cave is not accessible to the public because of safety concerns at low tide. Somebody also mentioned Rockefeller's
Bruce,
teeth.
they can't hear what you're answering, so everyone can't read those notes.
Oh, okay. These are in the chat. Um, no, just the cave that somebody mentioned is called Anemone Cave, is no longer accessible because of dangerousness. And
That
so Jordan,
Rockefeller's teeth is interesting. The rocks that line the carriage roads are called Rockefeller's teeth. Never heard
yes,
that one.
yep. So this is Jordan Pond, and as I mentioned with the carriage roads, this goes on this side, the western side of Jordan Pond, and you're up above Jordan Pond. And that really kind of sold me on the whole carriage road and the electric bicycles. This is just an amazing vista. You get this incredible view that you really don't get when you're down at Jordan Pond. The one thing I will say about Jordan Pond, of hiking around Jordan Pond, this side is pretty much flat. You get great access to views. Unfortunately, like around sunrise, you're fighting people to get views because the bubbles are here. And I'll show you a photo in a minute of this is probably one of the quintessential photographic spots within Acadia. On this side, on the western side of the pond, the hiking is really difficult because it's a lot of boards, and you have to kind of like hop over these boards, walk these boards. It's very, very kind of annoying in my mind. Of not an easy walk, and you have to kind of watch yourself. And they've got this whole boardwalk type of thing that's along that allows you access to go to this side of the lake. But the vistas and everything are just far better on this side, and it's a heck of a lot easier with a pretty flat trail. It's also famous for the Jordan Pond House popovers, which there is a restaurant there, and they serve popovers. Although oddly enough, it seems like they don't serve popovers on their takeout menu. But it's a nice place for a lunch, or I don't know how much they're open for dinner now. Their hours have really changed and inconsistent during COVID. But and of course, I say we're there after usually a lot of times after Columbus Day, so the things start to close down at that point. But this is one of your quintessential vistas you have in Acadia, which shows with the bubbles in the background. And this is Jordan Pond in the foreground, and you have rocks. Like last October, it was pretty dry, so you had a lot of rocks exposed, and it's just one of your quintessential photographic vistas with the rocks playing in the foreground, and you have the bubbles in the background. This is an infrared photo taken with that. That's a couple of years back, so there was more water there, but every photographer pretty much has to do an homage to the bubbles in Jordan Pond. And we have the Bass Harbor Lighthouse, which is down on the quiet side of the island, pretty close to Southwest Harbor. That's a sunset picture. This is the most photographed lighthouse from Acadia. Another infrared picture of Bass Harbor Lighthouse. I will say it's a little challenging to get over here and get this vista. You have to walk down quite a steep set of stairs, and you have to do some pretty good rock scaling to get over here to grasp this. You can walk up behind here from the parking lot and see this side of the lighthouse, but this is the quintessential photograph of Bass Harbor Lighthouse with the rock cliffs in the foreground, a little bit of the ocean there. But it takes a little bit of doing. As I get older, it becomes a little more challenging to get to this vista. This is the back side of the bubbles. This is actually Eagle Lake, which is the other side, Jordan Pond. If you kind of go across here, Jordan Pond will be further south here. This is Eagle Lake, which a lot of times when we've been there, it's very, very still and you get some amazing reflections. So it's an incredible photographic vista. And that's Egg Rock Lighthouse, which is off the going down the Park Road. It's on your left, one of the first pullouts you have for the Park Road. You can see Egg Rock there. The wildlife cruise you can go on goes out to Egg Rock, and I think it's this island here actually is chock full of seals. So you get to see a lot of wildlife there. This is Soamesville, which is at the head of the quiet side of the island. Soames, who gave his name to Soames Sound, I believe was one of the first settlers of Mount Desert Island. And so this is when you're quintessential, this little bridge there is something that gets, once again, shown a lot of times when you're looking at photographs of Mount Desert Island. And we'll leave you with a couple of contemplative vistas here. This is right near Seal Harbor last fall. Just you have the mountains, you have a little bit of the haze, the mist, and the clouds, and then this very bucolic scene, a little bit of fall foliage there. So once again, it's an incredible photographic vista, and then you have the merging of the sky and the ocean as you look off from, I think, Otter Cliffs. So with that, we'll talk a little bit about resources. There's a fair number of books. Nobody's written, I don't think, like a quintessential, history of Mount Desert Island and Acadia National Park, but there are some decent ones out there. There's a great bookstore called Sherman's, which has a couple of locations in Down East Maine. It does have one in downtown Bar Harbor. Phenomenal bookstore to go to and gift shop as well. Highly recommend that. They have a great section of local books there. But there have been, relatively recent books, people talking about the geology. Tom Wessels, who's kind of the dean of New England geology. He used to teach at Antioch University up in Keene, New Hampshire, and he's written a number of books about reading the forested landscape and different things that really get you to understand about how dynamic the landscape has been. And then he can do these amazing things to like walk through the woods and basically tell you why these things are there and kind of what different things are happening that created such a why those trees are there, some of those rock outcroppings. And he did a book on Acadia, another year before was a geology book, and then there are some historical books on it. And with that, a little plug, my next presentation virtually will be in May on the Transcendental Ramble. I'll be doing it in person if you're in the Groton, Massachusetts area. I'll be doing it in person on March 1st at 2:30 in the afternoon on a Saturday. You can find me on Instagram at @bmagphoto. I'm on Facebook at Bruce J. Magnuson Photography and on the web at brucemagnuson.smugmug.com. And with that, I will take any other questions you may have.
So Bruce, we had a few that I answered in the in the Q&A box. Someone had pointed out that there was a national park in Connecticut, and as you showed the map, it was not on there. And so you did answer this, that there's a very there's a differentiator between the National Historic Parks, because there's a lot of those. So that one did fall into that category, as you mentioned. Someone else asked the best month to pick blueberries, which is really mainly August, so late July to August. And I know you and I have bought, I don't know if we've ever picked blueberries, but there's certainly a lot of them on sale on the side of the roads as you travel, even as, York, an hour away, you get some great blueberries.
Yes, you want the small Maine blueberries.
Small, would make great pies.
Yeah, if you see some
And
big
then,
blueberries, you're getting taken for a ride.
the name Acadia, I did look that up, and I put that in the where it came from, where it was derived. So those are in the answered box. We have a question from Karen. What type of camera were you using?
Uh, Different ones. I mean, I have an iPhone. iPhone's fine. Like that long exposure picture of Thunder Hole, that was actually done with an iPhone. There's a feature you can do called Live, and when you take a picture live, it you can do different processing things. One of them is to make it look like a long exposure. I do shoot infrared. I didn't show a lot of infrared. I'd show a few infrared at the end. So that's kind of a complex, separate thing. We have to have a separate camera converted. But I basically have a Canon R. It's about a 5-year-old camera, various lenses, depending upon what you're going for with regard to, because it's a lot of, really up close, amazing things and some things in the distance. So, certainly wide angle lenses, long telephoto lenses, things along those lines. I don't play around too much with filters. And I have to say, I'm a bit lazy now. The whole long exposure thing with the iPhone, being able to do that makes it a lot easier than schlepping around with the tripod and, having a long shutter speed and all that kind of stuff. If you go to Scudic Point and you want to photograph waves, you get into all that kind of stuff. And certainly Scudic Point is one of the better places I'm aware of on the Maine coast to photograph waves. I'd say number one is probably Pemaquid, but that's a great place to do that. But I don't have anything, the infrared's kind of a bit off the beaten path, but most of it's kind of a normal camera. And certainly during the daytime, your smartphone does a great job. As long as you have good daylight. Low light starts to get a little funky with smartphones.
Bruce, someone mentioned taking the bus in the summer. We have never done that, but I'm not sure you mentioned that in your presentation, that due to the large crowds, you can take the bus to all the popular spots.
Yeah, I talked about the Island Explorer a bit.
Okay.
There is, yeah, like you said, we haven't really taken it. We've seen the drop off points for it. And I think they really restrict parking in the summer so they can shuffle people around with these Island Explorer. Those came into play, I think, when we started renting those houses in Southwest Harbor in the early 2000s. I think the Island Explorer was coming into being at that point. I mean, Bar Harbor has a lot of challenge. They have this with groups and with tourism because of the cruise ship industry. And it's a huge, huge debate up there about the cruise ships. And we've seen them, hanging out there even in the late fall, and they can bring a lot of people onto the island. Obviously, they're day trippers. They get dropped off, down at the base of the hill in Bar Harbor. There's all kinds of, tourism and vans and everything. They'll take you up to Cadillac Mountain, take you on the Park Loop Road. But there's been a big debate within Bar Harbor about restricting those. And of course, you have, a lot of the merchants like the business, a lot of the residents don't like all the crowds. So I think they do have a new dock that's further down away from downtown Bar Harbor there's a ferry that goes from Bar Harbor to Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, the Cat. So I think that leaves from that, and they were talking about using that for cruise ships. I don't know if they've actually done that or not, because we were there. We stayed at the Bar Harbor Inn. You could see the cruise ship out in the ocean, and they were having small boats ferry people in, which is rather laborious. And the cruise ships would rather be able to dock and just, have people disembark at that point. But every time we're up there seems to be always kind of signs up there about, over cruising, and it's something that's very difficult for them to manage because it really has been. Bar Harbor's a pretty small town. You go up there right now, there is not a lot going on in Bar Harbor. You go there in the middle of the summer and the place is absolutely mobbed. Even we've seen it in the fall. Like I said, we've kind of gone later and later each year in the fall, and the crowds seem to kind of be consistent.
Great. I don't see any more questions. Does anyone else have any questions they want to use? Type in the chat box or the Q&A box. Let's see, we have one. Any comments on Somme Sound as a fjord? I believe it's the only one in North America. I believe you did mention that, didn't you?
I did. I mean, the thing about Soame Sound is if you get really technical, it's actually not a fjord because a fjord, and I'm not sure, I don't know if a fjord's defined like a pond or it's not like a hard and fast definition, but my understanding of a fjord is there's supposed to be a very, very dramatic drop off from the land to this inlet of the ocean. So of course, the fjords are very famous in Norway and places like that. And there's a name for something where the drop off isn't quite as steep, and it's some Norwegian name that I can't pronounce. I do believe it begins FJ, but most people refer to Soame Sound as a fjord, and Steve does mention that's the only one in North America. I believe that may be true. I'm not sure if there's one in Pacific Northwest. I'm pretty sure it's definitely the only one as such on the eastern seaboard. But it's pretty
Lu
dramatic. We did take a cruise in Soame Sound. It's pretty cool.
Louise wanted to know what your favorite place in Acadia is, Bruce.
Yeah, I thought somebody would ask me that. It's a really interesting question, and I I have to say we've become really, really kind of enamored with the Jessup Trail by Sir Demont and those trails, Wonderland and what's the other one? Uh, Ships Harbor.
Ship's Harbor.
Those I just become really enamored with those. And it is, like I said, we go to Acadia pretty much every year, every other year, and it's always a struggle of we like going back to our favorite places, but then we like doing at least something new. And then some of those new things get incorporated. So a lot of times we get kind of frustrated, like, well, we can't do everything we want. But the Jessup Trail in the fall, I will say, because there are a lot of birches there, and there aren't a lot of birches I've seen in other parts of the park. It is really a great place of forest bathing, and now once you got this Homan Path there, which is relatively, pretty decent hike up a side of a hill, quasi mountain, and get some great views. Those are the ones that I think a lot of people aren't really familiar with that, and we didn't become aware of that till about, I don't know, 10 years ago or so. But
And that
Cadillac
beautiful
Mountains,
boardwalk too, that in so pretty.
yes, the boardwalk that you walk through the birch stand is amazing. But you have to go to Cadillac Mountain. I would say the one thing is Cadillac Mountain. That is just so unique because you are on the seaboard and you have this amazing, 1,500 feet up and you get these incredible vistas. Once again, don't go on a foggy day, but it is an amazing view. And that's something I would say, that would be my first check off if I'm going to recommend somebody to go to Acadia National Park, in which there's a lot of, I think, have to do's, but I would say that certainly Jordan Pond and Cadillac Mountain would be the two there.
And I think sitting on Jordan Pond, if you go in the summer and you can sit outside on the lawn and have popovers, like that's a pretty neat thing. It's not available in the fall, but in the summertime, it's pretty neat.
It is. It's a beautiful spot. There are a couple of
Someone asked if
questions.
you've been to Isle of Ho, Bruce.
Right. Yeah. She said she didn't. Yeah. I have not. I have not. There was a book written a few years ago. There was a lighthouse keeper who wrote a book probably about 20 years ago. They had this whole story of like throwing their trash in their life in the city and going to start a bed and breakfast at the lighthouse in Isle of Ho. And it sounds like a fascinating area. I really have not been down that peninsula where Stonington is. I mean, Stonington now is the base of the Maine lobster industry. Is the lobsters are migrating northeast about 4 miles a year. You're seeing that the lobstering trade is moving further and further north, and right now it's situated in Stonington. And then you take a mail boat or something from Stonington to Isle of Ho, but we have not got around to do that yet.
Bruce, someone mentioned they couldn't get tickets for Sunrise on Cadillac Mountain. And what we've learned is that some of the tickets are available way ahead of time, but then they also release a good deal of tickets like 2 days before, 2 or 3 days before. And that's how we usually have gotten our tickets is that if you go online at 10 a.m. a few days before, we've been pretty successful in doing that. So that's just a tip for someone if they're going like this year when the ticketing is active.
Yeah, you were telling me that when because you were had charge of the tickets and they released like 70% of them within a few days. You can buy them in advance, but it's a relatively small number. But they do save a lot before a couple of days. But yeah, sunrise is certainly, is difficult. And somebody talks about Astaku Garden. I don't know if that's officially part of Acadia. We have not been there because that's, I think, the last remnant of the Rockefeller estate. And it was Abby Rockefeller's personal garden. And yeah, it's supposed to be amazing. The problem is it closes in, I think, late September or early
Yeah.
October. So it's closed by the time we typically get to Acadia. So we have not been there.
The wild gardens of Acadia are supposed to be beautiful too. We only see them in the fall, but they're at that same place, the Certavant, and that's a really beautiful place even in the fall. But I think the summer they would be spectacular too.
Definitely.
I think we've answered most of the questions.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone. And thanks for your kudos. Appreciate it. Enjoy the rest of your night. Hopefully, if you're in New England, we'll get through our next storm. And I look forward to talking to you in the spring. Thanks
Thanks,
again.
everybody. Good night.